Hey there, friendos, and welcome to another episode of Makin Stuff Thangs. In this episode, I'm going to be creating this Jurassic Park themed light. Now, this film has held a special place in my heart from the moment I saw it 30 years ago. Yes, that's right. This year, Jurassic Park turns 30, and I wanted to make something to kind of represent the film and its 30-year anniversary. I also wanted to try my hand at adding real lighting and electronics to a build. Now, if you want to follow along or you want to build your own, you can actually download it from the link in the description. Alright, so let's jump right into it. First off, I do some cleanup. I just sanded it down with 80 grit sandpaper, then moved to 220 grit. For the bevels on the outer ring and the top ring, I use sanding sticks to make sure I keep those defined sharp edges. Some of the parts had just a little bit of Brachiosaurus foot, so I used an 80 grit sanding stick to bring that down. Next up, I spray it with some filler primer. I let this dry completely, then sand it down and smooth it out. As you sand, it breaks up into smaller particulates that then fill any small scratches and imperfections. Keep in mind that this will only take you so far. You may need to sand more and repeat the filler primer steps. Luckily for this particular build, I don't need much to be smooth. Mostly the outer ring, the top of the Jurassic Park ring, and the outside of the base. The rest will be either inside and will never be seen, or on the back of the base, which won't be seen either. Did you know that a T-Rex from Jurassic Park, its name is Roberta, at least according to the storyboards created by Phil Tippett? Now I'm going to paint some parts flat black. Before that, however, I want to clean the parts with isopropyl alcohol. There are only two parts that I'm going to paint black. Or paint at all, for that matter. Those two parts are the top ring with the Jurassic Park logo and the teeth. Yes, the teeth print out separate from the dino skeleton. Here's a tip: if you have tiny parts, like the teeth, sandwich them between some masking tape so that 1, you won't lose them, 2, you won't lose them, and 3, it makes it easier to paint. I tape the tape that the teeth are taped to onto the table along with the top ring. Then I get to spraying. During the scene where the T-Rex, Roberta, slams her head down into the glass of the car, one of the teeth was actually broken off by accident. Now, it's time to work on the acrylic disc that's going to go between the lighting and the top ring. I'm using this chrome yellow sheet that is 1/8 of an inch or 3 millimeters thick. The diameter is going to be roughly 6.4 inches. Fun fact, Sharpie markers are alcohol based, so using the isopropyl alcohol will remove the marker completely. That's a fun fact for parents with small children. To get a perfect circle, I use my compass. I set up the marker attachment that somehow I didn't know this thing had, despite having this compass for almost 20 years and using it a decent amount. Whatever. I measure out 3.2 inches, or the radius of the disc, then mark it. Cutting it out is a lot of fun! Possibly more fun than sanding! So this would be a heck of a lot easier if I had a bandsaw, but I don't. Instead, I use the next best thing that I have, my Dremel with a cutoff wheel for plastics. Make sure to wear safety glasses and a mask, and maybe even some long sleeves. This stuff spits out very hot, almost molten plastic. It's fun when you're done and you just have plastic fused to your arm and arm hairs. It's fun. Also, the smell is awful. After that, I set up my disc sander and start grinding it down. Not to the line, but rather, what I'm trying to do is get everything even, because it's all bumpy, trying to get it like an even circle. I'm still wearing glasses here and the mask, but I'm not dealing with too much plastic dust. Check this out. I have the sander hooked up to the shop vac, so it's mostly getting sucked away. A lot easier. Clean up so much better. My goodness. Now that it's basically rounded off, I start slowly sanding it down to the line. Here, I make a mark on it with a Sharpie. This is so I will know that I've sanded all the way around, from start to finish. This will help to make sure that I'm keeping it perfectly circular. I stop at the outside edge of the line and do a test fit. Be sure to go very slow with this, only shaving off a tiny bit at a time, and to keep it as perfectly circular as possible. Check the fit often. I keep going until the disc fits perfectly into the ring. Once it fits in there, sand the top and bottom with some 220 or 320 grit sandpaper to get rid of the glossiness on the surface. What I'm doing is adding diffusion so that the light from the LEDs will be broken up more, helping me avoid bright spots. The outer ring and the outer edge of the base will get some silver leafing. I figure the best time to do the leafing is before I do the wiring for the LEDs. This stuff gets everywhere and it is metal, so I want to reduce the chance of one of these flakes possibly shorting out the electronics. It's probably not something I really need to worry about, but I don't want to risk it. Leafing, or gilding, is pretty simple. First step is to use some adhesive size. I am using Speedball for this, but there are plenty of other options. You want to use a soft, wide brush. Put down a thin layer, making sure to do long strokes of the brush and avoiding creating bubbles on the surface. I only do about half of the outer ring and base on the first pass, and then I go and do the other half. This is so I just have a place to hold it. I put some silver leafing flakes into a cup and just use my fingers to put it onto the parts. It's messy. You can use a brush for this as well, it's less messy, but you have more control with your fingers. Do your best to get this stuff everywhere you put the glue. Once it's completely covered, I use a small chip brush. I cut the bristles short to make it better suited for this job. I tamp down the leafing all over. Then I go over the whole surface in small circular motions to get the excess leafing off. In the last scene of Jurassic Park, where the T-Rex has a raptor in its mouth, a single frame of the raptor model did not render out, causing it to disappear for a frame. After that, I get to work on completing the other half of the parts. For the lighting, I'm using this 5-foot LED strip that runs off 5 volts. I will be using 3 AA batteries, however, so this will be running at actually 3.5 volts. Before I lay out the LEDs, I want to make sure that I am running these straight across the base. That's what those Sharpie lines are for. To make these, I held it up to the light and actually traced the top and the bottom of the battery hole to get them. What I also do is take the outer ring and the inner ring and put them onto the base. Then I mark the inner part of the circle so I know the limit to how long the wires can be, or how far they can reach over. I don't want them hanging over too much, otherwise they'll be in the way when we assemble this. I made sure to purchase LEDs that can be cut down to size. They will be marked so you know where to cut them. I start measuring out the first strip, making sure to leave some room for the wires on each side. I cut the nearest spot that can be cut, then peel off the adhesive backing and stick it down. The backing can be pretty tough to separate at times, and I was struggling to not pull the actual adhesive tape off the back as well. I keep going with this until I reach the end of the spool. Yep, that's 5 feet right there. As you may or probably noticed, it's not enough. I had to buy a second spool to finish this up. Maybe take this into consideration when you buy your LEDs. Now for the soldering. Something I have not done since high school. That was, some time ago. Let's go over the plan first. I'm going to basically daisy chain the strips together. I'll hook the positive of the first strip to the positive below it. From the opposite side of that second strip, I'll connect it to the one below. I keep going until I've connected all of them. Then I go through and do the same for the ground wires. Finally, I hook up the wires from the battery pack to the very first pads. It should be pretty simple. To get started on soldering, you'll need a few things. First off, you'll need a good soldering iron, or even a whole station. I got one from Amazon for, I think, $50 or so. It does what it's designed to do, and it does it actually pretty well. It heats up quick and even shuts off on its own after 10 minutes of sitting idle. That's a really good feature for my ADHD. Now, for this, you're going to want to adjust the temperature to about 335 degrees Fahrenheit. You'll need decent solder as well. Mine came with the station, and I had no issues throughout the project. For this project, I am using 22 gauge wire. It's just the size I bought, no real reason in particular. Although, it does make it a lot easier to maneuver the wires around while working. Another thing you'll need is some sort of fan or filtration device. That smoke coming off the tip is the flux burning off, and it is very toxic. Do not solder unless you have proper ventilation that filters the smoke or completely removes it from where you are working, please. You can utilize certain gadgets to make this process a lot easier, for instance helping hands or these tweezers that I use. I used the flat grippy tweezers because it was a lot easier to hold on to the wires and bend them how I needed. Let's get to the actual soldering. I figure the easy way to do this is to basically pre-solder all of the pads on the ends with a decent sized ball of solder. I touch the tip of the soldering iron to one end of the pad and touch the soldering wire to the other end until a ball of solder forms on it. I grab a bit of wire from the spool and use a stripper to take just a tiny bit off the end of the wire. You want it to basically be the same size as the pad. Try not to let the exposed wiring hang over the edge. Anything to help reduce the chances of shorting out the circuit. I pre-tin the wire. For this, it works best to add a little ball of solder to the tip of the iron, then hold that on one side of the exposed wire. Then you touch the soldering wire to the opposite side. Eventually, the solder will suck itself into the wire. After that, I measure and cut the wire to length. I then strip the newly cut side and tin that as well. Now it's time to attach these wires. The way we set this up, it will be super easy, barely an inconvenience, as some might say. Simply hold the wire to the front of the solder ball while holding the tip of the iron to the back side. It'll eventually melt, then you just slide the wire into the ball, basically just plugging it in. Once the ball has melted and the wire was inserted, I moved the iron over the top to make sure everything was covered. So I did this over and over for the positive and the ground wires and decided to stop at about 1/3 of the way to test the wiring. Now to test it out, I attach 2 lead wires to the start of the strips and connect them temporarily to the battery pack wires using the lever nuts. These things are great for testing and prototyping. You just put a wire into one of the slots and clamp it down. Then pop the wire that you want to connect it to into the other slot and clamp it into place. Make sure both ends are stripped and there is exposed wire. I do this for both the positive and the ground wires, then turn on the switch to the battery pack, and it works! From here, with the proof of concept proven and the uncertainties now certain, I go ahead full steam with the wiring. Once all the wires are attached, I do one last test fire before I move on. It works! Still! This is the point where I remove the test leads from the strip. I just heated up the ball of solder and removed the wires. I did need to add some more solder on the pad after this, so I did that. I prepped the battery pack's wires for attaching them to the LEDs and feed them through the back of the base. I want to attach the battery door before I do anything else, so I don't have to worry about my dangly swinging about. For this, I mix up some 5-minute epoxy and spread it around the cutout for the machine screw nut. I don't put too much in there, and I try not to get it down in the hole for the actual screw. Then I plop in the nuts. Sorry. I smoosh it down and I add some more around the outer edge of the nut, making sure not to get it in the center. You also don't want to build up too much volume above, the nut, because you want it to fit together. I know it's called 5-minute epoxy, but I want to make sure it's completely cured before I screw on the door. I let it sit for a few hours. When I attach the door, I quickly realize there's too much wiggle room that makes it impossible to turn off the battery pack. So I printed out a little spacer to stick in there and hold it in place better. This will be included in the STL files as well. Now I attach the battery wires, and with that, we are done with soldering. Another test fire. It works! Still! Again! I want more slack in the wires when I go to change the batteries, so I pull them back through the hole. Not too tight though. You don't want to pull on the connection too much. I hold it in place and cover the wires at the hole with hot glue. I use my tweezers to push it under the wires and into the hole a bit. I add some more hot glue then. This is so when I take the battery pack out to change the batteries, it won't be pulling on the connections, but rather on the point where we put the glue. I test fit the parts onto the base. There's no glue involved yet. Test fire. Works. Still. Again. Now it's finally time to assemble this thing. First, I lay down a little bit of CA glue on the inner bottom ring and plop the acrylic disc into place. By the way, if you really want, you can use the 5-minute epoxy to glue everything together. Next, I put a little bit of glue on the top of the inner bottom ring. I also add a bit to the dino skeleton. Notice how little glue I am actually using, especially on the really small details. I don't want it to actually seep out the sides. Then I lay down the top in a ring and press it down. Now it's time for the teeth. Again, just a little bit of glue, and then I put them into place. I use my tweezers for the smallest teeths. Lastly, I add glue around the outside edge of the whole thing and slide the outer ring over top. I wipe away any excess glue, and with that, most of the assembly is finished. Now we need to attach this whole thing to the base. Before I do, I want to make sure that this is oriented correctly. You don't want a crooked dinosaur. So I attach it without any glue and line it up. From here, I add a piece of masking tape that covers the base and the upper portion. I cut the tape at the seam, lay down some glue, and put it on. I make sure the tape pieces line up perfectly. That's it. We're finished. Did you know that the barking noises of the velociraptors in Jurassic Park are actually the modified sounds of a tortoise getting it on? Yeah. Once you know that and you hear them barking, it's like, oh, I can't picture anything else.